Yeah, hello everyone. Again, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 8th part of our lecture series this year. The lecture series is entitled, as you know, The Contentious Koreans, Civil Society, Social Movements, and Human Rights Struggles in South Korea. And I'm very happy that we have so many participants from all parts of the world, I might say, our students who are in Korea at the moment, and also participants from the Graduate School of East Asian Studies in Berlin. So welcome to all of you, and also, of course, to all the others. And a very special welcome to Professor Vladimir Tikhonov. It is a great pleasure having you with us today. In the last few days, we had a lot of talks about more or less progressive movements in South Korea. So today we will have the opportunity to listen to something about, well, let's say more conservative or right-wing civil society, if we may call it like this, in South Korea. So I'm very happy that we have you here, Professor Tikhonov. Welcome. But now let me briefly introduce Professor Vladimir Tikhonov a bit more in detail. So Vladimir Tikhonov is also very well known as Pak No-ja in South Korea. He's actually quite famous. He writes columns for the newspaper Hankyoreh, and he also has his own blog in Korean language. So that's already great. He's very famous. Vladimir Tikhonov is a professor of Korean and East Asian Studies at the Department of Cultural Studies and Oriental Languages at the University of Oslo in Norway. Previously, he taught at Kyunghee University in Seoul until 2000. Professor Tikhonov's research focuses on the history of modern ideas in Korea, and currently especially on the Korean Communist movement. His recent publications include, for example, Social Darwinism and Nationalism in Korea, The Beginnings, from the 1880s until 1910s, as well as another volume, Modern Korea and Its Others, Perceptions of the Neighboring Countries and Korean Modernity. He also recently co-edited a book called Buddhist Modernities, Reinventing Tradition in the Globalizing Modern World, and Military Chaplaincy in an Era of Religious Pluralism. So as we can see, Professor Tikhonov is an eminent expert in many, many areas, and today I'm very happy that we have him here to focus on South Korea's new right, the politics of historical revisionism. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Professor Tikhonov. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for introducing me, for inviting me in the first order. So now, sorry for my inexperience with this technology. Now I will try to share my PowerPoint. So I'm going to talk today about politics of historical revisionism in South Korea, in particular reference to South Korea's so-called new right. As you will understand from my lecture very soon, this new right in reality is not very new. Much of what they are saying is basically a recycled position from what old right used to say for a very long time. Much of new right's ideological arsenal has been also borrowed from their Japanese neighbors, the Japanese right wing, in cooperation with which South Korean new right has been functioning for the last, say, 17 years. But before I start talking about that, one basic thing we have to remind ourselves about is what is historical revisionism. Historical revisionism, in principle, doesn't have to be right-wing. Well, there are all ideological kinds of historical revisionism. There is, for example, progressive revisionism as well. Revisionism is what always happens with history. Historical account is always being revised because, after all, societies develop, societies evolve, paradigms change. 70, 80 years ago, Columbus' discovery, so-called, of Americas was usually described in triumphalist tones. In today's accounts, even pretty standard mainstream accounts, it would be the suffering of the native inhabitants of Americas after Columbus' arrival. in a way, will take much more central stage in the account rather than triumph of the European discovery spirit. Obviously, the historical account has been revised, and in a way, you can say that is a revision to the better. There is progressive revisionism as well. In fact, when you talk about historical revisionism, what people often refer to is progressive revisionism of Cold War history. The work by such eminent scholars as Gabriel Kolko, original historical revisionist but of progressive kind, or Bruce Cummings in our Korean studies field, the people who were trying to put such events as Korean War, Vietnam War into wider context of United States imperial domination and expansion. It's also historical revisionism in a way, but of a different kind. Here, however, I will be talking about right-wing historical revisionism in South Korea. And the reason I'm talking about it, sorry, I'm trying now. Yes, I got it. The reason I'm talking about it is the fact that historical debates, especially the debates on colonial period history, are more lively than ever in South Korea today. They are important for Korean culture. Look at the number, for example, South Korean produced films about colonial period history. They're important for culture and they're very important for politics. More progressive South Koreans often imagine their conservative opponents as pro-Japanese. You have the caricature here, for example, conservative politicians pictured with samurai swords. And, well, of course, it's crude generalization. At the same time, it's a reality in a way. It's a fact that more conservative South Korean politicians have enjoyed very close connection to their Japanese counterparts. In fact, when it comes to conservatism, both historical and political, South Korea and Japan, South Korean ultra-conservatism, Japanese right-wing, very much, well, twin brothers, twin sister siblings. In a way, much of what they claim is in sync with each other, to put it this way. So those caricatures are not necessarily completely unjustified. You can look, for example, at what right-wing historical revisionists tell to their public in South Korea today. Here you see the face of the most representative historical revisionist in today's South Korean academia. Emeritus Professor Lee Yong-hoon from Seoul National University is a primary seat of learning in South Korea. And Professor Lee telling to his audience that Japanese, while they were ruling over Korea, were building railroads, they were building roads, they were building ports, they were planting the modern civilization in Korea, and Japanese Korean ethno-nation was showing its agency in fitting itself, adjusting itself to modern civilization brought by Japanese, and that's how we Koreans became modern individuals. This sort of account. Well, if you look at Japanese, for example, right-wing revisionist textbooks having been published in Japan during the last 20 years, you will find pretty similar statements. So obviously, connection is quite close. Well, one additional reason why we talk about right-wing historical revisionism in today's South Korea is because it appears in the recent years to become a sort of commercial success as well. South Korea is a pluralistic market society. Ideology in South Korea is de-staticized. We have market of ideologies. So to say that looks as if in the recent years, partly prompted by the problems for the growing generation, neoliberal situation in which younger Koreans feel themselves devoid of the future, general discontent with the existing setup and so on, different political forces can capitalize on the discontent. And it looks like the ultra-right-wing revisionists are making their gains as well. So recently, a book preaching right-wing historical revisionism entitled Anti-Japanese Tribalism, Panil Chonjok-Chui, published 2 years ago, has been making waves in Korean and Japanese ideological market space. It became a bestseller in both countries, actually more bestseller in Japan than South Korea. It sold around 400,000 copies in Japan. Japan is a huge book market. Japanese are still a reading nation, but still, again, to sell your book at such a number of copies, you need something for that. So this book, in a way, summarized the ideological statements, the ideological propositions of both Japanese and South Korean right-wing accumulated throughout the, say, 5, 6, 7 post-war decades. The book, of course, is deeply problematic, and not only for political progressives, but also for mainstream historians. As its critic for mainstream historiography, Professor Kang Son-hyun, points out, the book is first and foremost historically unprofessional. We historians are very, very choosy, we're very fastidious about the way how sources are to be used. Sources are to be put into the context. You cannot use, for example, statistics or statements produced by Japanese colonial authorities uncritically. You have to keep in mind the context in which they were produced, why those statistics were produced, what sort of power relationship existed beyond them. So this book, Anti-Japanese Tribalism, makes no such caveats, just using colonial authorities produced materials as if they were truth in the last instance. And then another question with this book is that obviously it ignores the statements, the evidences supplied by the victims. For example, the testimonies of the former Kamhot women sexual slaves, completely ignored. So obviously it's not how you produce a good professional history, but the book sold very well and it's still selling extremely well. And it's not only the book. Today, South Korea, still remaining a great reading power like Japan, is gradually switching to a SNS-driven modus of media existence. YouTube is now major power driver on the ideological market. And if you try to research on Korean language YouTube, you find out that right-wing channels rival in popularity the left-wing ones. Some right-wing historical channels are tremendously popular. One example would be Sinman Ri TV, appropriately named in honor of South Korea's first president, Sinman Ri. Professor Emeritus Lee Yong-hun now is the director of Sinman Ri School. That's his new title. So if you try to watch this Sinman Ri TV on YouTube, you find out that part of the podcasts, broadcasts are in Japanese, part in Korean, nothing in English, so obviously it works for Japanese and South Korean audience. What you find are lots of praises to Japanese colonial rulers, to South Korea's dictatorial rulers as well. And when South Korean dictators are being praised, it's not because they were dictators, but because according to the revisionist historians, they, while being dictators, also were adepts of free market capitalism and capitalist modern civilization. So obviously being a follower of free market capitalism excuses your dictatorial rule, according to this logic. And then there is lots of criticism of left-wing, both the current one and historical left, for example, Korean communist intellectuals of 20s and 30s. So you can take a look if you listen, if you can understand spoken Japanese or Korean, you can take a look if you're interested. Now, if we are to understand the logic of those debates, the debates which are extremely important in Japanese and South Korean ideological space, they sometimes spill over to the Anglophone academic space, but most of it is in Japanese and Korean. So if we are to understand the logic of those debates, we have to look into their prehistory. What was, after all, history writing, history accounts in South Korea before the recent times, before the new millennium? Well, as you oh no, I don't have maybe to repeat it many times. South Korea used to be a model poster boy of Cold War anti-communism. It wasn't the only anti-communist state, obviously, but it was a deeply anti-communist state. So anti-communism was Kuksi ilho. Kuksi literally means state truth. Probably you should translate it as state orthodoxy. State orthodoxy number one was anti-communism. State orthodoxy number two was what's supposed to be liberal democracy, to the degree you could believe it existed. However, anti-communism per se cannot create reliable historical narrative for a post-colonial nation. And a post-colonial nation, you need a narrative of struggle, sacrifice, liberation. Simply anti-communism is not enough. Aside from anti-communism, South Korean historical narrative was full of praises to mostly nationalist anti-Japanese fighters. Well, in reality, the physical and ideological hairs of those right-wing nationalist fighters didn't take a very prominent place in South Korean establishment's hierarchy. You don't find the descendants of prominent nationalist fighters among, say, chaebol conglomerate owners or among the major state officials. They were, but they were very, very few. I remember you see Kim Gu here, one of the major nationalist icons. Kim Gu's son was once South Korea's ambassador to Taiwan. So Kim Gu's descendants were promoted to official posts. But again, those people were very few, and they did not constitute the backbone of South Korea's ruling class. The backbone of South Korea's ruling class were, after all, the descendants of the colonial elite, of the people who, of course, collaborated with the Japanese. But anyway, in reality, colonial elite and its descendants more or less ruled the society and the country. Ideologically, right-wing nationalism's history of armed struggle was promoted as the orthodox historical narrative. It changed a bit in the 1990s, and South Korea, after all, became at least institutionally democratic. What happens when democracy comes? You could witness it in Eastern Europe exactly at the same time in the 1990s. What happens when democracy comes is that all sort of suppressed narratives, suppressed truths just emerge at once. It was happening throughout the Eastern Bloc after the 1989, and it was happening, of course, in South Korea as well, approximately the same time. Suppressed truth in South Korea, however, was the truth about the terrible massacres after the liberation, when, for example, 1/4 of Jeju Island population disappeared, either massacred or having to flee to Japan. That's what happened in Jeju after the April 3rd so-called incident in 1948. Jeju leftists tried to resist the unilateral elections in South Korea only, and then a huge massacre by the governmental forces followed, leaving more than 30,000 people dead. Several tens of thousands had to flee for Japan. So that was very uncomfortable truth about what was happening in South Korea after liberation. This truth had been concealed for a very long time. It exploded. It sort of imploded. It came out in the 1990s. All the truth about the partisans, the communist guerrillas who were able to fight against what they considered Syngman Rhee's puppet junta. They had been fighting until mid-1950s in the mountains of South Korea. So here you have a film poster, a film about the communist guerrillas. This part of history also wasn't supposed to be talked about before. Well, but the biggest taboo was not massacres or communist guerrillas. The biggest taboo, which had to be challenged in the 1990s, was the issue of what the institutional and physical ancestors of the present South Korean elite were doing during the Japanese colonial time. That is the issue of collaboration. In a post-colonial society like South Korea, collaboration, pro-colonial collaboration, is a mortal blow to your political legitimacy. Obviously, for a post-colonial society, if you collaborated with the colonizers, that tarnishes you a lot. So this issue had been kept hidden for a very long time. There were some brave individuals who challenged the taboo, like this gentleman, Lim Jong-guk, a maverick literature researcher whose own father was an official in Japanese controlled Korea. He wrote this book about so-called pro-Japanese literature in mid-1960s. It was just silenced away. No criticism, no mentions. He could legally publish it, but that was all. He was never employed. He had no official employment at all. So if you were trying to challenge this taboo, the society would just hide you in a way, bury you away. You would never make anything. You would never make a career. So this taboo was, however, challenged in the 1990s, as now you could safely write about the issues of colonial era collaboration without risking your career, risking your material well-being. And what South Korean people found out by the mid-1990s, that the owners of nation's biggest dailies, Chosun Il-bo's Pang families, ancestor Pan and Mo, Tonga Il-bo's Kim family, ancestor Kim Son-soo, a very influential former president of Ihwa Women's University, Kim Hwa-lam, a father of the present owner of another influential daily, Hon Suk-hyun's father, Hon Jin-gi, South Korea's premier composer Hon Nam-pao, Paek Nak-chun, yet another influential notable, former president of Yonsei University. All of them were very actively collaborating with the Japanese occupiers, doing lots of things obviously atrociously bad from today's viewpoint, and perhaps from Korean, in a way, national viewpoint, even at the time of the events, for example, appealing to Koreans to join Japanese Imperial Army at that time, conducting a war of aggression against China. Obviously, war of aggression is an international crime, and appeals to join an army of aggression is a serious problem. I mean, it would be serious international legal problem for those people as well. So we found out that the institutional and physical ancestors of the people who own much of South Korea Incorporated were, in fact, Japanese colonizers' close collaborators. Then what was supposed to happen? After all, South Korea was now a democracy. In a democracy, you cannot simply silence away the issues like this. And as Marx once has remarked, the ideas which have taken control of the popular mind become physical force. Marx was right as always. Obviously now the issue of pro-Japanese collaboration by the ancestors, institutional and physical, of South Korean elite was becoming a political issue, and a democratic country state had to do something. So liberal administration of President Roh Moo-hyun had to convene a special committee investigating the issue of the collaboration. Head of committee, Professor Kan Mang-gil, a famous Marxist researcher known as the dean of South Korea's indigenous Marxist historiography from the 1970s. Committee mostly consisted of established mainstream researchers, some probably more Marxist than sort of you can expect in South Korean academia, but nevertheless pretty mainstream people. They produced a multi-volume report on the pro-Japanese collaboration activities, very academic writing. I have it at home. Very interesting reading, by the way. The state started to move, and those moves had also, as we will find out, their own legal logic, because collaborators, those people who were now known as pro-Japanese collaborators couldn't, for example, have their status all over the country. One such person was Kim Son-soo, the founder, proprietor of Tonga Il-bo Daily. The daily still exists. It's still very important. It's third largest daily in South Korea. It's still controlled by Kim's descendants. And now, as Kim was delegitimized as pro-colonial collaborator, his statues now are supposed to be removed throughout the country. Of course, for Tonga Il-bo, for this influential daily, that was a tight spot, obviously was a trouble. Well, some other interesting things that were happening at the same time as President Roh Moo-hyun's administration, President Kim Dae-jun's administration were trying to do something with the collaborators issue. Yet some different things were happening as well. For one thing, for example, South Korea remained a post-colonial society. Nationalism remained deeply enshrined in a way politically, popularly. At the same time as society matured, democracy matured, South Korea was becoming richer and in a way was gradually joining the world systemic core in a way, in socio-economical meaning of the word. So some South Korean intellectuals started to actively accept, mostly from Japan, the so-called post-nationalist ideology, relativizing nationalism and trying to move on further than post-colonial, anti-colonial nationalism in which South Korean intellectual world has been schooled for so long. So post-nationalism was fashionable in Japan in 1970s, 1980s, as Japan matured as industrial society. This fashion came to South Korea in 1990s, approximately. One reason it was so important for South Korea was that the country was now becoming increasingly diverse ethnically. Nationalism in Korea is traditionally ethno-based. It's post-colonial nationalism, and in colonial times, nationalism meant the advocacy of the rights of ethnic Korean subjects of the Japanese Empire. Japanese Empire practiced extremely strict ethnic discrimination, which also meant that the anti-imperial nationalism had to be ethnic. South Korean nationalism used to be ethnic, and the word for nation used there, Minjok, actually connotes ethno-nation. But now, by the beginning of the new millennium, it was quite obvious that South Korea is quickly becoming a multi-ethnic society. It was already obvious in the first years of the new millennium. And now, if you look at the trends today more than 4% of South Korean population is foreign-born. So the boundaries of ethno-nation are being increasingly blurred. South Korea is becoming huge polyethnic conglomerate with different migrant enclaves, very different foreign-born communities, including the reverse migrants of Korean ethnicity from China and former Soviet Union. In such a society, simply ethno-nationalist ideology would not work, and that was yet another factor which we have to keep in mind when we are talking about historical battles in South Korea. Neither left nor right could be fully satisfied with Korean nationalism as it existed before. Left, however, was able to find progressive versions of post-nationalism. Well, multiculturalist ideology obviously is what South Korean left is very preoccupied with. Now, solidaristic versions of progressive post-nationalism and so on. On the right, moving beyond nationalism meant rather moving towards right-wing revisionism, which emphasized empire rather than Korean nation, which emphasized Japanese empire and its contributions. So, in a way, moving beyond Korean nationalism, South Korean new rights moved towards accepting many tenets of ultra-right-wing Japanese nationalism. Wow. It all started in the beginning of the new millennium, since especially Tonga'ilbo proprietors were terribly warned, sort of terribly afraid of the processes taking place in the country, of all those of the state investigating the collaborative activities of Kim Son-soo, the founder of the Daily, and the great-grandfather of the current owners of the Daily. So Tonga'ilbo started to feature contributions where those who were trying to investigate Japanese period collaboration activities were accused of being leftist, pro-North Koreans, and unable to see the brighter side of colonial past. Then things were going further by the year 2004. At that time, our liberal president Roh Moo-hyun was impeached. The conservatives were trying to mount an offensive. One part of this offensive was to establish officially several so-called new right institutions. New rights were calling themselves new and not the old rights in order to emphasize that in sync with the spirit of the time, they are no longer traditional nationalists. They are cosmopolitan, internationalist. They embrace some sort of universal standards, free markets, things like this. That's what they considered global standards, their actually beloved buzzword. So they were supposed, however, to overcome the masochist view of history at the same time. And masochist view of history was actually an expression they borrowed from Japanese extreme right-wing jargon. Japanese extreme right-wing considers all talks about Japanese militaries' terrible behavior during the World War II masochist view of history. So Korean New Rights, in a way, embraced this concept. So, and not only in that, if you look at the, say, new history textbooks published by the Japanese right-wingers, the year 2001, you find there lots of the same ideologies, the same statements than you then find in the South Korean new right propaganda. For example, attempt to deny that so-called comfort women, sexual slaves, were ever coerced into slavery or ever used violence against, ever had their human rights abused. According to the Japanese ultra-right wing, they were voluntarily prostitutes. And South Korean New Right, although they try to avoid using the vocabulary which can bring them defamation lawsuits. They basically follow more the same similar logic. We should remember that revisionism, after all, is not something particular to Japan or South Korea. Right-wing revisionism exists everywhere. Europe, North America, obviously. They have their own niche on the global ideological market. So obviously what is happening in Japan or South Korea is part of those global developments. If we are to talk about the international context of the new right in South Korea, the Japanese teachers, obviously you have for example, historical ideologies like Niall Ferguson. I wouldn't call him a historian, actually, because I'm afraid of using his books in teaching or research because they're full of factual errors. Too many exaggerations, too many untrustworthy statistics. I would not use it. It's not good history. So, but anyway, the idea that any capitalist empire is good because it's spreading civilization, obviously this idea, so loved by Korean New Right, so obviously has been taken from the arsenals, ideological arsenals of the global new right-wing revisionism. Well, as you understand, to be a right-wing revisionist in our times may be also a dangerous occupation because obviously the victims of colonial exploitation, their descendants, don't like right-wing historical revisionism. They don't like also the established view of history in more conservative Western societies, which justifies the colonial misdeeds of European powers. And we have lots of episodes of struggle against this sort of historical view. Our recent case, a journal, by the way, which used to be quite progressive before, Southwell Quarterly. 4 years ago, they tried to publish an article under very epatage, in a way, under very challenging title, The Case for Colonialism, the article, which purported to prove that colonialism was good and decolonization was bad. So it had to be deleted from their website very soon. So obviously, we have attempts to revise history from right-wing perspective here in Euro-American world as well. And those attempts in new right ideology in South Korea have to be analyzed in close interconnection, I would suggest. Let's go back now to new right history of South Korea. New rights were developing as Roh Moo-hyun administration was gradually losing its popularity. since it was not only liberal but also neoliberal at the same time. It was quite liberal when it came to historical issues, but in economy it was neoliberal. It was introducing new laws, for example, allowing broader use of non-permanent employees, contract-based employment, things like this. It was quickly losing its prestige and authority, and right-wingers, of course, were trying to capitalize on this, obviously. So the next year, 2005, brought several interesting developments. One was so-called Han Seung-jo incident. Emeritus Korean professor wrote an article for extremely right-wing Japanese journal saying basically just everything Japanese right-wing wanted him to say. Basically saying that Japanese colonial good was the biggest imaginable benefit for Korea. The article was translated and introduced to South Korean public. A scandal came and new rights were trying to put some distance between themselves and Han. They were afraid that so open statement, so explicit statement of their position may delegitimize themselves before they accomplished their main goal, namely to revise historical textbooks. That's what new rights wanted to do in order to drastically change historical perceptions in the new generation. Yet a new important development in that year was a publication of book by Park Yu-ha, Japanese studies professor from Sejong University in Seoul, entitled very well, mainstream way, for the reconciliation. Reconciliation is a good thing, isn't it? Obviously, if you contravene the spirit of reconciliation, doesn't look nice. So, however, this book, the title notwithstanding, was actually an attempt to, using the very fashionable post-nationalist lexicon, it was an attempt to suggest that all Korean grievances against Japanese empire are just anti-Japanese nationalism and nothing more. Well, to be sure, of course, you can say that post-colonial South Korea used the language of anti-imperialist nationalism. That's completely true. However, this anti-imperialist nationalism builds on very real colonial era grievances. What Park Yu-ha attempted to do was to downplay the grievances and foreground the fact that Korea's anti-Japanese nationalism was, just as any other nationalism, exclusivist, aggressive, and so on. So it was an attempt to reduce all the problems Koreans have with the imperial legacy, which was just, there was no cleaning of the imperial debris, so to say. In Korea, the victims of imperial violence, for the most part, were never compensated. So to say, that was the real issue on which the post-colonial nationalism largely built up. Park Yu-ha, however, attempted to reduce everything to irrational nationalism of Koreans only. That was logic of the Japanese right wing, which new right now was being appropriating. New rights never were a monolith formation. There were different streams there. Academic new rights, for example, were not necessarily the same as political new rights. And then some new rights, the so-called National Alliance of the New Right, were actually much more like old right, while another group of new rights were perhaps more interested in global standards, free markets, and universal human rights ideology, which they, however, applied to North Korea only. They had zero interest in South Koreans' human rights. So there were conflicts becoming more visible inside the new right formation. And at that year, this famous collection of articles came out. The book entitled The Reinterpretation of the History Before and After the Liberation. History Before and After the Liberation was a left nationalist Marxist bestseller of the 1980s, a book on which whole generation of progressives in South Korea was raised. This book attempted to refute its statements, and it emphasized again that Japan was spreading modern civilization, that modern civilization was the same as capitalism, that capitalism and modern civilization in the end prompted Korea almost to the core of the world system, and that North Korea refused to accept the basic tenets of modern civilization, and that's why it's so pre-modern. So that was, concisely speaking, the statement of this book. So that was an attempt to academize new right discourse. However, this attempt was obviously problematic from historical viewpoint, very ahistorical. Any historian would tell you that Japanese were not conducting their policies in Korea with a view to make it with a view to civilize it or promote capitalism or universal values. They were obviously exploiting Korea and were trying to rule it for the benefit of the empire. So those attempts were obviously ahistorical, and they prompted a group of historians, post-nationalist historians, to take distance from the new rights. Because obviously those people didn't want to be enmeshed in the right-wing politicization of their history writing business. So this group of post-nationalist historians published their collection, Rereading Modernity, where they tried to state their post-nationalist beliefs without falling too much to the new right side. Well, new rights, however, were continuing on their chosen path. As the Roh-Moo-Hyun administration collapsed the year 2008, a new ultra-right-wing president, Lee Myung-bak, took power. A first edition of New Rights textbook for Korean modern and contemporary history came out. You had there all the buzzwords the New Right liked so much. That colonial period allowed Korea to learn modern civilization. And then, of course, that post-colonial dictatorships were giving Korea an opportunity for high-speed development. Again, the same capitalist civilization being developed. Huge problem, of course, with this view of history was that it was in a way extremely inconsistent. On the one hand, new rights were proudly calling themselves liberal democrats. On the other side, all the regimes they were praising, from Japanese colonial regime to Sin Man-ri and Pak Chun-hee's dictatorships, had nothing to do at all with any real liberal democracy. Sin Man-ri was trying to imitate liberal democracy, but his rule was anything but liberal or democratic. That was one obvious contradiction, after all. If you praise dictators, you should not call yourself a liberal democrat. Another problem was that many statements by the New Right historians were factually inaccurate. Same problem you have with the likes of Niall Ferguson. Here in our part of the world, impossible to refer to his books because just so many factual inaccuracies there. For example, a chief New Right historian, Lee Yong-hoon, says that Tahan Empire, Korean Empire, annexed by Japan, collapsed on itself. But again, we have lots of very good historical research documenting its attempts to reform and modernize itself. Or another statement is that in Tahan Empire, there was no idea of private ownership of land. But it's factually untrue. There was 90% of land was privately owned. There were land deeds. Ownership was clearly demarked, and we have lots of documents certifying how land was bought and sold. Obviously, it's just completely factual and true. So that's one problem we have with New Right historians. Very hard to believe in the factual correctness of their statements because it's so much doctored for political use. And of course, you have questions of broader thought. Like, for example, conceptualizing the Japanese colonial period as modern civilization. Well, it was modern in the meaning that it certainly was a bureaucratic imperial state, which also was industrializing. In that meaning, it was modern. At the same time, Japanese imperial ideology included such institutes as state Shinto and imperial worship, which hardly had much in common with what we understand as the self-critical, in a way, spirit modernity. Much of the ideological infrastructure of the Japanese empire was built on pre-modern foundations. It was a theocracy in a way. And then again, the people, new rights, calling themselves liberal democrats, were praising not only dictatorial regimes, but also the regimes, economical success of which largely depended on neo-mercantilist, state-driven industrialization policies. So, Park Geun-hye regime in 1960s and 1970s was developing, industrializing South Korea very much with the state as a locomotive engine of the industrialization, very much in full contradiction to all those neoliberal principles which South Korean New Right seemingly champions. So then another question is then how you explain this? And New Rights are not able to answer this question, and political behavior of the New Rights, again, betrays very illiberal foundations of their political beliefs. Korean right-wing developed a veritable cult of Park Geun-hye. Well, his daughter was a very unsuccessful president, impeached and now in prison for gross corruption. And it looks like South Korean New Rights were perfectly fine with the fact that a late dictator had been literally worshipped. Although, again, what relationship does it have to liberal democracy? Liberal democracies are not supposed to worship individuals, well, certainly not late dictators. In fact, worship of Park Geun-hye is now a necessary required ritual. If you want to be a right-wing politician in South Korea, you have to perform this sort of thing. That's how you get votes. And you have worship, well, you have the right-wing politicians saying, for example, that late Park Geun-hye was panin pansin, half god and half human. What relationship does it have to liberal democracy or to any sort of modern rationality? I don't know. In fact, such statements are easily comparable to the ways in which North Korea treats its deceased rulers. But that would be the last thing South Korean right-wingers, especially, and new right-wingers as well would tell you. Here you have a Buddhist temple in metropolitan Seoul where Park Geun-hye and his wife, devout Buddhists, are being worshipped as well. New rights are perfectly content with the ways in which worship of this kind is happening. All those contradictions, obvious, glaring contradictions, were destroying the academic authority of the new rights. By the end of the first decade of the new millennium, it became clear for professional historians that the whole New Right movement has little to do with good, professional, believable history. So most professional historians were just trying to take distance from it and not get too much enmeshed into it. It was becoming much of a scandal. After all, Korea was already more or less established democratic society. And in such a society, if you have too close relationship with the sect of worshippers of late dictators, it would tarnish your reputation. So when new rights tried to build their own academic society, Association for the Study of Korean Contemporary History, well, some historians joined, but very, very few. Absolute majority of mainstream historians would have nothing to do with this group of people. It's considered very bad for professional reputation. So, in the end, by the year 2013, the new rights, beloved Park Geun-hye, daughter of the late dictator Park Geun-hye, took power. And New Right once again published their version of Korean history textbook. However, soon it was found out that the textbook contained more than 800 factual mistakes. So the Ministry of Education had to had to get it revised several times. And even after the revisions, after it was published, it was found out that mistakes are still were there. Textbook was obviously very non-professional. For any history teacher, it was clear that this book is not suitable for teaching, if only because the accounts were so awkwardly written, so full of inaccuracies in a way, and so lopsided. So it was adopted only by, say, around 20 high schools in the whole country. Complete defeat for the New Rights. New Rights were trying then, as Park Geun-hye was in power, it was easy for them to coerce school administration into accepting New Right professors as guest speakers. So the years 2013, 14, 15, you had lots of New Right intellectuals touring the schools and trying to explain to the school pupils that colonial rule was good because it civilized Korean dictatorship was good, that capitalism is good, and that there is only one civilization, and that's capitalist civilization. You see the reaction of the pupils. Since Korean schools are pretty authoritarian, if there is a guest lecture, you have to attend, even if you don't want. But some students were picketing, demonstrating, protesting, and those who could not protest were just sleeping during the lectures, because obviously those old men, mostly men, who were touring the schools and talking and praising lay dictators simply didn't attract enough interest, didn't attract enough curiosity. So it looked as if the New Rights could not fulfill their goal. Obviously, things didn't work as they wanted. Koreans didn't want to buy their narrative. Schools didn't want to adopt their textbook. Scholars didn't want to join the academic society. So New Rights were praising free market. But on the free market of ideas, their narrative has been suffering defeat. So they were praising free market. They could not succeed on the free market. That was a problem. So facing this problem, they tried to solve it through the same way as, say, South Korean presidents, dictatorial presidents were supposedly modernizing South Korea by using the state power. Prompted by the New Rights and her own desire to somehow justify the pro-Japanese collaboration activities of her father, late President Park Geun-hye, Park Geun-hye proclaimed the nationalization of Korean history textbooks. So basically, she told that now Korea is going to have a unitary history textbook. It was understood that it was going to be New Right history textbook. A commission was convened to write the new unitary history textbook. It mostly consisted of either old right or new right scholars. So it was quite obvious what sort of unitary textbook it was going to be. However, now New Rights and Park Geun-hye found out that Korea became really more or less established democracy during those decades. Absolute majority of history teachers were against the idea, almost 80%. So obviously Koreans now were accustomed to free market of ideas. They didn't want a unitary textbook. In fact, the critics pointed out immediately that the countries which have unitary textbooks are the countries like North Korea, Vietnam, and China. Okay. Are those countries the places which liberal democratic South Korea wanted to imitate? So teachers were against, obviously. Most historians were against it. Absolute majority of professional historians were completely against it. Historians went out to the streets, started demonstrating. So what happened was that as soon as the new administration of President Moon Jae-in took the power year 2017 after Park Geun-hye was impeached, as soon as it happened, the whole project has been discontinued and scrapped. Immediately scrapped. That was the first thing that Moon Jae-in did after he took power. Well, by that time, New Rights existed in South Korea for 13 years. So it was an established political and academic movement. And you can say that probably by that time it really looked as if the movement was perhaps much more political than academical. Academically, new rights tarnished themselves too much to be recognized as bona fide genuine academics. After all, if you are making so many factual errors in your narratives, and if you are so hopelessly one-sided, most professional historians, it looks like those people no longer follow the norms of the historical community, accepted norms of the historical community. So new rights now were showing their colors as much more political than academic movement. However, what happened after that was that new rights didn't want to accept the defeat, and they once again tried to succeed on the free market of the ideological goods. This time, it looks like the success was closer to them. The new book, which I have previously mentioned, The Anti-Japanese Tribalism, was published the year 2019, and it was selling very well, especially among South Koreans in their 20s. It has something to do with complicated developments in the Korean population. People in their 20s don't know anything but neoliberalism. They were raised after South Korea switched to neoliberalism in the late of the 1990s. Neoliberalism means competition, it means very little solidarity. It means that you are to fit into the market, you are to outcompete the others, and your main relationship is with your examiners. You have very little horizontal relationship. South Korean neoliberalism means that most social relationships are vertical. You have to pass the exams successfully. You have to boost up your competitive strengths, and that's how you climb up in the ranks. So this ethos of competition, self-promotion, and vertical rather than horizontal ties became very much like air for too many young people in South Korea. And the message of the book, which in a way found out that predecessors of supposed neoliberal success of South Korea were exactly the Japanese colonialists. They built up the foundation for South Korea becoming such a successful state as it is now. Looks like this message started to get close to the minds of those in their 20s. It says something about the effects of neoliberal education on the youth, about the ethos of neoliberalism, the atmosphere in neoliberal South Korea. So after the crushing defeat year 2017, new rights came back. Now they are back, and they are an important force to reckon in South Korean society or South Korean ideological market. That's what I have previously mentioned when I was talking to you. I think I've been already talking for around an hour, so I'm going to wind it up now and then getting your questions and answers if you just allow me to make my conclusion. The results of new right movement, I observed it now, I've been observing it now for 17 years. So what I see now after 17 years of observation are very mixed results. New rights very much, in a way, articulate something I would call Chaebol view of history, the view of history, first and foremost beneficial for the big business owners, the real ruling stratum of the South Korean society. Many of those big businesses, like Samsung, had been established in late Japanese colonial period. They, of course, benefited from collaborating with Japanese colonialists. And from their perspective, colonialism was, of course, good for them. So this Chaebol perspective is more or less what New Right articulates. So New Rights tried, in a way, to impose this perspective onto the population in general. In the beginning, it did not work. It was at least impossible to force professional historical community to believe that colonialism was good and dictatorship was good as well. It looks, however, as if we are talking about not professional historical community, but general public, it looks like as if those Chabot historical views the new right articulates are now making some important inroads into the reading and listening public. It looks like in the recent years, probably aided by the general crisis in South Korean society, general societal, socioeconomic crisis, those views are becoming increasingly influential, especially among the younger people. So the ideological battle is going on. There is so far no clear winner, and the contention is going to continue for the time being. When it comes to professional historical community, here, of course, new rights certainly could not achieve any sort of hegemony. For professional historians, it's just too unprofessional. The way they narrate history, you wouldn't take it seriously. It's impossible to refer to, it's impossible to cite. Nobody would believe you. So to say, because new right historians cherry pick their statistics, cherry pick the figures they like, dismiss the figures they don't like. They're very selective in using historical sources. It's not serious. You can't work this way. So professional historians mostly so far eschewed new right-wingers. However, if you look at how professional history is being written in South Korea now, we find out that there is a thing I would call a cultural turn. Generally, history is increasingly interested in depoliticized subjects. You see, in 80s and 90s, prompted by a wave of radicalism, historians were much more interested in anti-systemic contention, in the struggles from below, in social conflicts. Today's history is more interested in history of consumption, including the consumption of culture, and history of everyday life. Since those apolitical genres of history also sell very well, and historians have to feed themselves into a new commercial and institutional landscape. Many universities, historical departments now in South Korea are called historical contents departments. They are charged with developing contents for South Korean mass culture. So obviously historians have to feed themselves into this new context. So now history is being depoliticized. The moments of struggle and contention are being mostly taken distance from. History is becoming much more mainstream, much more focused on middle class and its consuming habits. So new rights didn't conquer historical community in South Korea, but this historical community has been changing. And I would say that if you chart its evolution using the political criteria of right and left, I think it would probably be moving more to the right. But however, it's not specifically South Korean problem. If you look at how, for example, history as academic discipline has been evolving in Japan or China, you will find pretty similar trends, actually. So again, we probably should recognize it as a wider issue. So here we are. I think that my lecture as such is over now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Tikhonov. That was a great lecture, great insight, actually, and also I think a great addition to our lecture series, because in the last few days we had to focus more on, well, how to frame it, on grassroots movements, people that are marginalized, that are unprivileged, who try to change something in Korean politics and society. And today we see that social movements can also mean, well, movements from those that are actually in power or have been in power and want to keep their privileges, more or less, right? So that was a great addition. Thank you so much.
Me too. Thank you very much for inviting me. And then hope we meet once again in not so distant future. Thank you.